Liberalism section, The Empty Cradle and the Destiny of the Indians. While for some peoples it involved subjection to a form of servile labor, for others, quote, master race democracy, which was now on the point of becoming established on a planetary scale, issued in decimation or destruction, leading the Union's war against the secessionist states and promoting the abolition of slavery was a figure, Lincoln, who, like Jefferson before him, toyed with the idea of deporting the blacks to Africa or Latin America, and who was a veteran of the wars against the Indians, against, quote, men, women, and children, mercilessly cut to pieces. In 1871, General Francis C. Walker, Commissioner for Indian Affairs, proposed to treat, quote, wild men no differently from, quote, wild beasts. The comparison we have already encountered in Washington, and which presided over the substantial erasure of the Indians, and the natives of Australia and New Zealand, from the face of the earth, thus makes its reappearance. A genealogical myth derived from the Old Testament was called upon to legitimize these genocidal practices. A major modern historian, Arnold Toynbee, observed, beginning of long quote, the, quote, Bible Christian of European origin and race, who has settled among peoples of non-European race overseas, has inevitably identified himself with Israel, obeying the will of Jehovah and doing the Lord's work by taking possession of the Promised Land, while he has identified the non-Europeans who have crossed his path with the Canaanites, whom the Lord has delivered into the hand of his chosen people to be destroyed or subjugated. Under this inspiration, the English-speaking Protestant settlers in the New World exterminated the North American Indian, as well as the bison, from coast to coast of the continent. End quote. This genealogical myth, which presided over the expropriation, deportation, and decimation of the Irish and the Indians, was explicitly present in Liber. Quote, God has given this great country to us, as much as he gave Palestine to the Jews. End quote. No mention was made of the Indians, even if they seem to be implicitly compared to the populations that occupied the Promised Land without authorization prior to the arrival of the chosen people. Democracy in America seems to support this deadly genealogical myth. De Tocqueville underlined the religious fervor of New England's founders, who regarded themselves as descendants from, quote, Abraham's stock. In the writings and documents left behind by them, one sensed, quote, the very savor of gospel antiquity. It was an aroma that in a way ended up turning the head of the French liberal himself. He uncritically adopted and subscribed to the description Nathaniel Morton, one of the colony's founders and first leaders, gave of the Pilgrims' Fathers' arrival in America. Quote, what could they see but a hideous and desolate wilderness, full of wild beasts and wild men? And what multitudes of them there were, they then knew not. The whole country, full of woods and thickets, represented a wild and savage hue. End quote. In this text, as in the Old Testament description of the unauthorized inhabitants of Canaan, those destined to be subjugated or wiped out by the chosen people, or as de Tocqueville characterized it, quote, the germ of a great nation wafted by Providence to a predestined shore, end quote, are completely confounded with nature. This providential design is all the more clear because, ultimately, it involved a desert. It is a theme democracy in America returns to repeatedly. The Indian, quote, has nothing to oppose to our perfection in the arts but the resources of the wilderness. End quote. One phrase is especially significant, quote, the Indians were the sole inhabitants of the wilds whence they have since been expelled. End quote. The desert ceased to be such, becoming a place inhabited by humans, only with the entry of the Europeans and the flight or deportation of the indigenous population. As we know, Locke and Montesquieu preferred to speak of, quote, virgin forests. But even though the two metaphors are different, their meaning is identical. We are dealing with places where there is no human trace, an area that is, as Locke put it, vacant. When subsequently forced to register the presence of the Indians, de Tocqueville hastened to stress that they had no right to the land occupied by them. Beginning of long quote. Although the vast country that I have been describing was inhabited by many indigenous tribes, it may justly be said, at the time of its discovery by Europeans, to have formed one great desert. The Indians occupied without possessing it. It is by agricultural labor that man appropriates the soil, and the early inhabitants of North America lived by the produce of the chase. End quote. For Locke already, the sole possible foundation of property right was labor, of which a people dedicated exclusively to hunting were incapable. But an explicitly theological justification was added by de Tocqueville to seal the fate of the Indians. Beginning of long quote. They seem to have been placed by Providence amid the riches of the New World, only to enjoy them for a season. They were there merely to wait till others came. Those coasts, so admirably adapted for commerce and industry, those wide and deep rivers, that inexhaustible valley of the Mississippi, the whole continent, in short, seemed prepared to be the abode of a great nation yet unborn. End quote. In this way, de Tocqueville ended up legitimizing the policy of deportation implemented by Jackson, president of the Transatlantic Republic when the French liberal visited it. The argument of the empty cradle was widespread in the U.S. culture of the time. Oliver Wendell Holmes, a, quote, freethinker, aligned with the liberals, and a writer and intellectual who enjoyed undisputed prestige in Boston, had no doubts in interpreting God's will. Only pending the arrival of a superior stock had the Indians been placed on American soil. Thereafter, they were clearly marked out for, quote, destruction or extermination. Franklin had not argued very differently when he attributed to a providential design the devastating effect of alcohol on a population destined to be wiped off the face of the earth. De Tocqueville's attitude was more pained. He did not shut his eyes to the horrors that were occurring. Yet, however distressing, the tragedy of the Indians expressed both the progress of civilization and a providential design. In any event, it was ineluctable. Beginning of long quote. Their implacable prejudices, their uncontrolled passions, their vices, and still more, perhaps, their savage virtues, consigned them to inevitable destruction. The ruin of these tribes began from the day when Europeans landed on their shores. It has proceeded ever since, and we are now witnessing its completion. End quote. True, de Tocqueville expressed unease at the, quote, cold egotism, utter insensitivity, and ruthless sentiment with which the white population of the United States, so attached to its morality and Christianity, viewed the fate of the Indians. Yet the French liberals' description of the, quote, savages, more than ever recalcitrant to, quote, civilization, certainly did not conduce to the cause of their salvation. Beginning of long quote. As a general rule, their mouth was disproportionately large, and their facial expression ignoble and wicked. Their physiognomy exhibited that deep depravity which can only derive from a long abuse of civilization, and yet they were still savages. Mixed with the vices they have adopted from us is something barbaric and uncivilized, making them 100 times more repugnant. Their movements were rapid and uncoordinated, their voice shrill and tuneless, their glance worried and savage. On first contact, one would be tempted to regard them as nothing but a beast of the forest, on which education has been able to confer a semblance of humanity, but which has nevertheless remained an animal. End quote. We can now understand the question de Tocqueville posed to his U.S. interlocutors. Quote, Do the Indians have an idea that sooner or later their race will be destroyed by ours? End quote. The Indians' deportation and decimation made explicit the fact that the North American territory was an, quote, empty cradle, awaiting the white settler committed from the time of his arrival to, quote, struggling against the obstacles that nature opposes to him, against the wilderness and savage life, end quote. Once again, what ends up emerging is the process of dehumanization of the natives, reduced, even more than to barbarism, to inanimate nature. End of section.